Tonight, on Lurking Moon, turn down the lights, keep an open mind, and join us for 5 unsettling stories of mysterious broadcasts, hidden documents, unexplained aerial phenomena, and encounters that may have marked the beginning of something far beyond human understanding.
I was already pulling off my name tag when the first channel switched over, and I remember thinking that was strange because the news had just started. It was a Tuesday night in Des Moines, Iowa, and I had worked a double shift at the register at Fairway Grocery on East University Avenue. My feet ached, my back was tight, and all I wanted was to sit on my couch and decompress in front of the television. I never expected that the television was going to decompress me in ways I still can't explain. I changed into my worn-out sweatpants and settled into the couch cushion that had already learned the shape of my body. The remote was warm from sitting near the lamp all day. I clicked to channel 13, which I always watched after work, and what I got wasn't the anchor desk. It was a sky, just a sky, flat, gray, completely still, like someone had photographed a storm that refused to move. No weather banner, no ticker, no logo in the corner. Just that gray hanging sky and a high-pitched tone that sat right behind my ears like a needle looking for a nerve. I switched channels. Channel 5, same sky. Channel 8, same sky. I went through every preset I had, and not a single one gave me anything different. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was my neighbor, Karen Hollis, from 2 houses down, asking if my TV was broken too. That was the moment I understood this wasn't my set. This was everywhere. The tone didn't waver. It held the same pitch for minutes without breathing, without variation, without the kind of technical hiccup you'd expect from a real malfunction. Underneath it, layered so quietly I almost missed it, was a voice, then another voice, then several, stacking on top of each other in different languages. I couldn't identify most of them. One sounded like it might have been German. One sounded like nothing I had ever heard from any human mouth. They were all saying the same phrase, whatever it was, over and over in a slow rhythm that matched nothing natural. I grabbed my phone and hit record. I didn't know why exactly. Some instinct that said document this before it disappears. My hands were shaking, and the apartment felt colder than it had any right to be in July, and I kept the phone aimed at the screen while my stomach turned over. Somewhere outside, a dog on my block began howling, then another, then several more, until the whole east side of Des Moines seemed to be responding to something none of us could name. The gray sky on the screen shifted, not dramatically, not like a cut to a new scene. It shifted the way a curtain shifts when someone behind it breathes, and in the lower right corner of the image, barely visible against that flat gray nothing, there was a shape, upright, still, looking directly into the camera from whatever distance it occupied. I stood up from the couch. I don't remember deciding to do that. My body just decided for me, the way it does when every quiet instinct fires at once. The figure didn't move. It just watched, and the watching felt specific, the way someone stares at you across a room when they have already decided something about you. My recording lasted 3 seconds before my phone went dark and rebooted itself. By the time the screen came back up, the image on the television had returned to a normal broadcast. A perfectly composed anchor sat behind a perfectly lit desk, explaining that a national technical failure had disrupted signals across multiple networks, and that engineers had resolved the issue. She smiled. The segment lasted 45 seconds. There were no follow-up questions, no technical explanation, no graphic, no expert, just a woman smiling and then a commercial for car insurance. I sat back down slowly. My phone had the footage. 3 seconds of gray sky, a faint layered voice that sounded like it was counting or reciting, and then in the last frame, that shape in the corner, upright, facing forward. The resolution wasn't great because my hands had been shaking, but the shape was there. It was not a reflection. It was not a camera artifact. It was a figure standing inside the image, looking out from whatever distance it occupied. The broadcasts have been normal since that night. No interruptions, no tones, no stacked voices counting in languages that shouldn't exist. But every time I turn on the television after a late shift, I give myself a second before I look at the screen. Just 1 second, because I am not entirely sure that what I saw that Tuesday night in Des Moines was a one-time event. I am not entirely sure that the figure in the gray sky was finished with whatever it came here to do. And some nights, when the dog down the block starts howling for no reason, I keep the television off, and I wait, and I listen, and the silence feels exactly like something about to begin.
The lights were already there when I pulled the bus out of the depot, and I didn't understand what I was looking at until my third stop on Kellogg Avenue, when every single passenger on board went completely silent at the same moment. That kind of silence has a weight to it. It lands on you. I had been driving Route 7 through Wichita, Kansas for 11 years, and I had never once felt that particular heaviness settle over a bus full of strangers before the sun had even decided to show up. It was 4:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had just checked the dash clock at my stop near the corner of Kellogg and Hydraulic, the one where the street light has been half dim for 2 years and nobody has fixed it. 3 passengers boarded. A woman in scrubs who I recognized as a regular, a young man with a backpack, and an older gentleman I had never seen before who sat in the very first seat behind me without making a sound. Within 60 seconds of pulling back onto Kellogg, every person on the bus had their phone out, not scrolling, not typing, just staring. I watched them in the wide mirror above my head. 8 people, all holding their screens up, all reading the same thing at the same moment. The woman in scrubs, whose name I knew as Linda Marsh because she had told me once during a long red light, pressed her hand flat against her chest like she was trying to keep something inside. The young man with the backpack slowly lowered it to the floor between his feet. Nobody said a word to anyone else. The alert read, "Remain indoors until further notice. This is an official message from the Department of Homeland Security. This is not a test." I know what it said because Linda Marsh turned her phone toward the mirror so I could see the screen. She didn't explain it. She just held it up and then pulled it back and stared out the window. That was when I looked up through the upper curve of the windshield and saw the formation above the city. There were 9 of them. I counted twice to be sure. 9 white gold lights, evenly spaced, holding a formation so precise it looked measured by something that did not make errors. I pulled the bus to the curb on Kellogg just west of the I-135 overpass. I told myself it was a safety stop. The truth is, my hands needed somewhere to be that wasn't gripping a steering wheel over a road I suddenly didn't trust. The passengers didn't question it. They were all looking up now, those who were seated on the left side of the bus, pressing their faces toward the glass, breath fogging the windows in the cold morning air. The older man in the first seat had not moved at all. He was looking straight ahead through the windshield at the lights, and his expression was not frightened, it was resigned. The way a person looks when something they always expected finally arrives. My radio crackled. Dispatch came through with a short message telling all drivers to hold position and await further instruction. No explanation, just hold position. I had been a bus driver for over a decade, and dispatch had never once told me to hold position. That phrase belonged to a different kind of world, a military world, a world where large things were being managed by people in rooms I would never be allowed into. The lights did not move for 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock the entire time, the way you watch a clock when you are afraid and need something solid to hold on to. During those 22 minutes, the city around us was quieter than I had ever heard Wichita at any hour. No sirens, no aircraft, no highway noise from the overpass above us. The world had gone still in a way that felt less like quiet and more like held breath. Then the lights rose, slowly, together, maintaining their exact formation. They lifted above the western skyline and continued upward until the dark sky absorbed them. Not one of them broke from the triangle, not one of them flickered or accelerated. They simply went up, and then they were gone, and Wichita exhaled around us without knowing it had been holding its breath at all. Dispatch came back on 20 minutes later, saying routes could resume. By 5:40 in the morning, I was back on schedule, stopping at corners, opening doors, watching people bored with their coffee cups and their earbuds and their ordinary Tuesday faces. The Homeland Security alert disappeared from phones by 6 a.m. No follow-up message, no press statement that I ever saw reported, just silence dressed up as resolution. I still drive Route 7. I still pass the same half-dim streetlight at Kellogg and Hydraulic every morning before the sun comes up, and every single time I roll through that stretch of road, I look up through the top of the windshield at the western sky above Wichita. Not because I expect to see nothing. I look because I know what organized stillness looks like now, and I know that whatever held that formation over this city on that Tuesday morning did not leave because it was finished. It left because it was done with that particular moment. There is a difference, and the difference keeps me checking the sky every morning before anyone else is awake enough to notice.
I found the folder on a Wednesday afternoon in the back section of the Sangamon County Records Office on Jefferson Street, and the moment I pulled it from between two cataloged boxes, I knew it did not belong there. Not because it was damaged or misfiled in any obvious way, but because it had no label, no intake stamp, no reference number or color coding along the spine that matched any system our office had used in the last 40 years. I had been a records clerk in Springfield, Illinois for 16 years. I knew every folder in that archive the way a librarian knows their shelves. This one had appeared from nowhere, and it was thick. The room I work in smells like old paper, and the particular dry cold that county buildings seem to manufacture on their own, regardless of the season outside. I sat down at my sorting table under the fluorescent light that buzzes faintly on the left side, the one that Facilities has been promising to fix since the previous administration, and I opened the folder. The first thing I noticed was that the photographs inside were printed on a type of paper that didn't match anything we used in this office. Heavier, slightly glossy in a way that felt older than digital printing, but too clean to be darkroom work. I set the first one flat on the table and leaned in close. It was an aerial photograph of Springfield. I recognized the layout immediately. The curve of the downtown grid, the Capitol building visible from above, the stretch of land along South Grand Avenue. The image was black and white, and based on the resolution and the visible rooftop styles of the buildings below, I guessed it had been taken sometime in the late 1960s or early 1970s. But the date stamped in the lower right corner read August 14, 1971, and that wasn't what stopped my breathing. What stopped my breathing was the object in the upper portion of the photograph, suspended above the city at an altitude that placed it clearly above the tallest structures but below the cloud line, was a circular structure of enormous size. Not a blur, not a lens artifact, not a weather balloon stretched by the camera angle. It was a defined, solid disc shape with a slightly raised center, casting a shadow on the rooftops below that matched its outline precisely. The shadow alone was large enough to cover several city blocks. Whatever that object was, it had been physically present above Springfield, Illinois in the summer of 1971, and someone had photographed it from an aircraft and then buried the evidence in an uncatalogued folder inside a county archive, where it sat for decades, waiting for someone exactly like me to find it. There were 11 photographs in the folder. Each one showed the same object from a slightly different angle or altitude, as if the aircraft had circled it during the pass. In 2 of the images, the structure was close enough to the camera that I could see what appeared to be surface detail along the outer ring. Not rivets or panels the way a human-built craft would look. Something smoother and more continuous, like a single piece of material formed rather than assembled. My hands were steady when I turned the pages, which surprised me because my chest was doing something entirely different. The last item in the folder was not a photograph. It was a single typed page with no letterhead and no signature, and it described the photographs in clinical, detached language as documentation of an aerial anomaly observed and recorded by a contracted survey team operating under a federal land assessment program. The page noted that the anomaly had been present for a period of no less than 3 hours, that it had not responded to any radio contact attempt, and that it had departed without sound or visible propulsion. The final sentence read, "Material is being retained at the county level, pending review by designated federal personnel." There was no indication that any such review had ever occurred. The folder had simply stayed. I locked the folder in my desk drawer and spent the rest of the afternoon working through my normal intake queue as if nothing had happened. I am good at that, at keeping my face arranged properly, while my mind works through something it cannot yet explain. On my drive home along 6th Street, I kept both hands on the wheel and the radio off. That night, I turned on the television to make dinner, and the national news was already in the middle of a report. The anchor was describing a release of previously classified government documents related to unidentified aerial phenomena observed over American cities during a span of decades beginning in the 1950s. The report named several cities. Springfield, Illinois was among them. I stood in my kitchen in front of the stove with the burner still cold and watched the segment until it ended. The documents referenced in the report were described as partial, incomplete, portions still withheld pending ongoing review. Nobody on the broadcast mentioned county archives. Nobody mentioned 1971. Nobody mentioned a disc large enough to shadow several city blocks on a mid-sized American afternoon, while contracted photographers circled it from above. The folder is still in my desk drawer at the Sangamon County Records Office. I have not reported it to my supervisor, a careful man named David Hargrove, who I trust completely with ordinary problems. I have not photographed it with my phone. I have not told anyone, which is its own kind of weight to carry into work every morning. What I do is unlock my drawer when I arrive, confirm the folder is still there, and lock it again. Every day, as if checking that it hasn't disappeared is the same thing as understanding why it was left there in the first place. I don't think it was an accident. I don't think anything about that folder or that object above Springfield or the timing of that broadcast was accidental in any way, and I don't think whoever placed it there is finished with whatever they started.
The tower had been generating interference for 6 hours before my supervisor called me out to look at it, and by the time I pulled my van onto Elmwood Drive in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the complaints from the Czech Village neighborhood had already stacked up enough to fill 2 pages on the dispatch log. I had been a cable technician for 14 years, and interference calls were as routine as anything in this job. You drive out, you connect your diagnostic equipment, you find the fault, you fix it, you go home. That was the entire shape of my Tuesday, until the moment I put my headset on and heard the first voice come through the signal. The tower sits on a low rise just off the main corridor, visible from most of the surrounding blocks, a standard municipal communication structure that serves the cable and internet infrastructure for the residential grid in that part of the city. Nothing remarkable about it from the outside. I parked at the base, pulled my gear from the back of the van, and started running the standard connection check the way I had done hundreds of times before. The morning was overcast and still, the kind of Iowa fall morning where the sky sits low and the air has that particular smell of wet leaves and coming cold. I clipped my diagnostic unit to the access panel, put on my headset, and began cycling through the frequency bands to locate the source of the interference. What I found was not a fault. It was a broadcast. The signal was clean, cleaner than anything I had encountered on a standard residential tower, actually, with a clarity that didn't match the age or the output rating of the equipment I was looking at. And running underneath that clean signal, steady and unhurried, were voices. Not static shaped like voices, not cross-frequency bleed from a nearby radio source, actual human voices, distinct and separate, speaking in full sentences with the natural rhythm of ordinary conversation. I recognized the audio texture immediately. These were local people. The cadence, the flat Midwestern vowels, the casual pace of it, all of it belonged to the neighborhood surrounding me. I stood at the base of that tower for a long time listening, a woman's voice describing what she planned to make for dinner that evening, a man's voice mentioning that his back had been bothering him since the weekend, a child asking a question about something at school. Ordinary fragments of ordinary life layered one over another in a stream that didn't stop and didn't repeat. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. It was 9:40 in the morning. The dinner conversation I just heard described a meal that hadn't been cooked yet. The man's comment about his back used the past tense about the weekend that had already happened, but the child's question referenced a school event scheduled for the following Thursday. I took off the headset and stood there in the gray morning air looking up at the tower. My diagnostic unit was still running, its small screen scrolling through frequency data in green text. I put the headset back on. The voices continued. I began writing down fragments on the back of my dispatch sheet, the only paper I had. A woman named Carol Simmons, whose name I did not know at the time but would later confirm, described a phone call she had not yet made to her sister. A man talked about finding something in his garage that he hadn't described finding yet when I knocked on his door an hour later to verify what I had heard. He looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has just been told something that shouldn't be possible, and then he went very quiet. The signal was not receiving the neighborhood, it was running ahead of it. Whatever the tower was broadcasting, it was pulling from a version of Cedar Rapids that existed somewhere between now and later, and it was transmitting that version back to the present through equipment that had no technical capacity to do what it was doing. I called my supervisor, a steady man named Greg Paulson, who had been in the industry longer than me, and I told him the interference had a non-standard origin and that I needed more time on site. I did not tell him what I was actually hearing. Some information lands wrong over a work phone line in the middle of a Tuesday morning. I stayed at the tower for another 3 hours, filling the back of every paper I had in the van with fragments of conversations that had not yet happened. At 2 in the afternoon, I went back to my van and opened my laptop to check the news. A conference was being held that day in Washington, a nationally broadcast session in which government officials and researchers were presenting findings related to non-human intelligence and its potential interactions with civilian infrastructure. The session had started at 9 that morning. The tower's interference had begun at the same hour. I drove home that evening on autopilot, taking the long way around Czech Village without deciding to, the way your body sometimes avoids a place before your mind has finished thinking why. The tower was still standing on its low rise when I passed it. The interference had not been resolved. I had submitted no repair report because there was nothing to repair. The equipment was functioning exactly as something was intending it to function. Brian Foster, cable technician, 14 years on the job. I still take calls in Cedar Rapids. I still drive past that corridor on Elmwood. And every single time I do, I leave my headset in the bag because I already know the tower is still talking, and I am not ready to hear how far ahead of us it has gotten.
I was folding the side panels of my cart near the Custom House Plaza end of Fisherman's Wharf when the first person stopped walking and looked west, and within 30 seconds, every single person on that waterfront had done the same thing. That is not an exaggeration. I have worked that stretch of Monterey's waterfront for 9 years, selling roasted nuts and dried fruit from a cart that I push out before the morning fog lifts and pull back after the evening light dies over the Pacific. I know that waterfront the way I know my own kitchen. I know how the tourists move, how the locals move, how the light changes the mood of a crowd without anyone noticing it happening. What happened that Thursday evening was none of those things. The sky had been doing something unusual for about 20 minutes before the crowd stopped. Not dramatically unusual, not the kind of thing that makes you reach for your phone right away, but the clouds over the water had a particular density to them that didn't match the forecast or the season. They sat lower than they should have, and they weren't moving the way Pacific clouds move, which is always with some restlessness, some drift. These were still in a way that felt deliberate. The way a held breath is different from an empty room. I noticed the first person stop because she was directly in my line of sight, a woman in a yellow jacket, maybe 30 years old, who had been walking toward the wharf shops with a child beside her. She stopped mid-step and looked out over the water with her chin raised, the way you look when something above you is too large to take in at a normal angle. The child stopped too, then the couple behind them, then the group of 4 coming from the other direction, then everyone. Within 1 minute, the entire visible length of the Monterey waterfront was still. Hundreds of people facing west, silent. I came around the side of my cart and looked. The shadow crossed the cloud layer from north to south, and it was enormous. Not the shadow of a cloud, which spreads and softens and has no defined edge. This had edges, a leading edge and a trailing edge, both curved, both part of the same vast circular outline that moved through the clouds the way a plate moves under shallow water, displacing the surface as it goes, but not breaking it. The shape beneath the clouds was darker than the clouds themselves, and it blocked what was left of the evening light in a band wide enough to cover the entire visible horizon from where I was standing. I estimated later, trying to work out the geometry of it, that the object casting that shadow was at minimum a mile across, possibly more. It made no sound. That was the thing that reached into my chest and took hold. Something that size, moving at that altitude, should have produced something. Pressure, vibration, the kind of low frequency that you feel in your back teeth before you hear it with your ears. There was nothing. The waterfront was quieter in that moment than I had ever heard it, and the silence felt less like an absence of noise and more like noise being actively removed from the air around us. My phone turned itself off. I felt it happen in my jacket pocket, the small shudder of an unexpected shutdown. Around me, I could see other people looking down at their screens with confused expressions, holding up dark rectangles, pressing buttons that weren't responding. Every phone on that waterfront went off at the same moment. I know this because I asked people afterward, a woman named Diane Kowalski, who runs the fudge shop near the wharf entrance, a retired teacher named Paul Granger, who had been sitting on one of the benches facing the bay. Both of them confirmed the same thing. Every device died simultaneously and came back on approximately 90 seconds later, rebooting without explanation. When my phone came back on, I opened the camera and took the photograph. The shadow was still crossing the cloud layer, the trailing edge now visible and curved in the same way as the leading edge had been, completing the circle. In the lower portion of the frame, where the sky meets the water near the horizon, there is a shape, not the shadow above, something below it, closer to the ocean's surface, darker than the water and darker than the clouds, descending at an angle toward the Pacific in a way that no natural object descends. I have looked at that photograph on my phone screen more times than I can count, zooming in on that lower shape until the pixels break apart, trying to find a different explanation. I have not found one. The next morning, the Monterey County authorities issued a brief statement attributing the previous evening's event to an unusual atmospheric light condition caused by marine layer interaction. The statement used confident language. It named a meteorological process. It did not mention the shadow. It did not mention the phones. It did not mention that hundreds of people had stood motionless on the waterfront for the better part of 4 minutes, staring at something that crossed the sky without sound and left the ocean disturbed in a long, slow pattern that the harbor master logged that night as an unexplained wave sequence originating from no identified source. I still push my cart out every morning and pull it back every evening. I still face west when the light goes. The photograph is still on my phone, and I have not deleted it, and I have not posted it anywhere, and I am not sure I will. What I know is that the Pacific looked different the morning after. Not visually different, not in any way I could point to on a map, just different in the way a room feels different after someone has been in it while you were sleeping. Something was there, something came down, and the water that closes over a thing like that closes completely and gives nothing back, and the sky above it stays exactly as empty as whoever wants it to look.